Good afternoon and warm welcome to our GGA mining webinar hosted in partnership with Mail and Guardian. Well, as you're aware, our topic today is focusing on mainstreaming ESG performance in fragile jurisdictions. Many of you will know that the global energy transition is shaping the African mining sector as priorities for global energy supply shift towards electric vehicle and battery production and greener technologies. Though some African governments are still heavily reliant on fossil fuels for economic development, many have shown commitment towards enabling a low carbon future. So, for instance, in the wake of the 26th Conference of Parties, that is the COP26 conference in November 2021, South Africa's just transition partnership with the United States, Britain, and the European Union, France, and Germany is set to mobilize 131 billion rand in concessional loans and grants to finance South Africa's decarbonization. So quite evidently, some efforts are being made. Well, to this end, minerals such as nickel, lithium, copper, and cobalt have become increasingly critical to achieving what is being described as the just energy transition, most of which are available in abundance in many parts of our continent, Africa. While at the same time, environmental, social, and governance performance is becoming a critical tool through which firms access capital. Historically, ESG considerations have been ignored because unethical firms, unfortunately, prefer to externalize social and environmental costs, and deterrence against such behavior was seemingly inefficient. This led to wide-scale environmental degradation and abuse of human rights. So, due to growing external pressures, businesses are being compelled to integrate ESG principles into day-to-day business operations and into their long-term investment strategies. Among the external pressures are increasing climate change concerns, issues of diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and overall corporate responsibility. So ESG may yet prove to be what we hope will be a market disciplining tool that incentivizes firms to internalize the costs of traditional negative externalities and minimize risks that have too often been overlooked in the extractive industries. In fragile mining jurisdictions, ESG management has become increasingly important for operating responsibly and effectively. And certainly we hope to hear a little bit more about this from the various speakers who will be speaking in detail about this particular point. It may also move firms towards investing in stronger governance and institutional capacity to overcome the challenges of inadequate infrastructure, ineffective and uncertain regulatory environments, a lack of transparency, accountability, poor governance, and a lack of public participation in decision-making processes. Well, with that mouthful, it brings me to today's panel discussion. We were honored to have 6 very distinguished speakers joining us to shed light on the topic at hand. Increasingly, the resources required to drive the 4th and certainly the 5th industrial revolution are found in these fragile contexts. We want to find out how to ensure that mining becomes a real catalyst for shared value and broad-based benefit. How do we ensure that companies take their social and the environmental responsibility roles more seriously? And also, I think we'll try and get our guest today on how we shape investment decisions in ways that really value long-run returns over short-term profits, and how do we better engage local mine affected communities, and how do we mainstream this ESG performance that we're talking about today in these fragile jurisdictions like Zimbabwe and Mozambique. And we have speakers today who will be speaking specifically about them. So joining us are none other than Deji Hestrap, who is the Chief Consultant and CEO at Strategic Communications Solutions. We'll also be joined a little later by Adam Matthews, who is the Chief Responsible Investment Officer of the Church of England Board. We also have our long-standing friend and interlocutor with GGA, Tracy Cooper, who's Executive Director at Mining Dialogues 360. We also have another friend of ours, Dr. David Matsinye, who is a researcher at Amnesty International, and a man I call Sekuru, which in Chishona means uncle. We have Dr. Ibo Mandazo, who is Executive Director at SAPE's Trust. And last but certainly not least, my own colleague, Musisi Siobi, who is lead researcher in the Natural Resources Governance at GGA. So let me start off by inviting, as I indicated earlier on, my good friend Deji Hestrap to give in about 5 or so minutes your introductory remarks to today's panel discussion. Deji, over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I hope you can all hear me. It's a real pleasure always to participate in these dialogues because it enriches one and provides an opportunity also to spread the gospel, as I call it. The topic I'll be speaking on today is the importance of mainstreaming social performance in Africa's extractive industry. Well, what do we mean by mainstreaming social performance, and why is it important? How can this be achieved by the extractive industry in Africa? These I would try to address as succinctly as possible in the time we have. First of all, mainstreaming social performance calls for a paradigm shift. It does not entail a change in business goals by the mining business, but it does require a change in business strategy. The extractive industry will continue to ensure that it maintains and continuously improves its capability to increase return on shareholder investment. That's what some refer to as a profit motive. That will not change. What will change is how the industry will and must achieve this goal. Post-Glasgow, the extractive industry will need to vastly improve its capacity to provide not just a good return on shareholder investment, but a healthy return on stakeholder interests. Now, we're all familiar with the term shareholder investment, but what do we mean by stakeholder interest? And who are stakeholders? How can business activities yield a high return on stakeholder interest? Stakeholders include all those key groups in society who may have a direct or not so direct impact on the success of the business, or those who may be impacted by the activities of the business, either directly or indirectly, by virtue of who they are, where they live, or what they do. By stakeholder interest, what we mean is the interest that each stakeholder has, its individual objective and reason to support or not support the mining business, the motivation the stakeholders have for wanting the mining business to succeed and grow or to fail. Stakeholder interests can be as varied as the number of stakeholders, but they all share a common interest in what ties them to the mining enterprise. the success or failure of the business can impact them as much as they can also impact the mining industry. In the past, the extractive industry had the luxury of seeing the interests of shareholders as separate and paramount, but often at odds with those of the stakeholders. But not anymore. In the new world, and particularly post-Glasgow, it will become increasingly difficult for the extractive business to attain its long-term business goals without taking into account the interests of the stakeholders. The extractive industry must align stakeholder interests with its business goals. And this can be done. It is being done by making social performance integral to business performance in a single holistic business strategy. This is what we mean by mainstreaming social performance. There are a host of key stakeholders in the extractive industry. Some of the institutional shareholders are themselves key stakeholders. Some of them have invested in the industry for the sole purpose of influencing policy and governance, especially at annual general meetings. They are therefore a key stakeholder group. The host government is another important stakeholder group. They make the laws that affect the industry. They collect taxes on behalf of the citizens, and their decisions can impact the business. The decisions can help or hinder the extractive industry from accomplishing its goals. And then there are the local communities and landowners where the extraction is located. They are an important stakeholder group. They own the land and live close to the enterprise. Their attitude to the mining industry and their behavior can impact the enterprise positively or negatively. And then there are the company's employees and the management. They are key to the success of the enterprise. Very often they are taken for granted, but this set of stakeholders are very important in implementing the new paradigm shift. And then there are the trade unions, civil society organizations. The civil society organizations are themselves quite diverse, and they represent various interests, including land, air, and water resources, the environment, human rights, and most importantly, climate change. With the importance and urgency of these issues, particularly of climate change, this group of stakeholders are growing in significance to the extractive industry. All of these stakeholders have different interests, as outlined. The activities can impact the mining industry in many different ways. They can have an impact on the areas of interest of these stakeholders, just as the mining industry can also have an impact on the constituencies these stakeholders represent. And first and foremost, the stakeholders have responsibilities to their primary constituencies and the society at large. All of them also have certain expectations of the mining industry. They expect some form of return on their stakeholder interest. The more integrated and inclusive of stakeholder interests the business strategy is, the more the overall objectives of the mining business and society are aligned, the more the extractive industry in Africa will continue to be profitable and sustainable over the long term. The real performance of the extractive business can best be evaluated based on how much it has aligned social and business goals and whether these has led to an improvement in the return on stakeholders' interests as it has on shareholders' investment. There are true and tested formulas for mainstreaming social performance and integrating social and business goals. And if time allows, I could say a few words on this. I know a lot of mining enterprises. Yes.
Sorry, Deji, you are somewhat over the 5 minutes that we've allocated. So if you don't mind, if you could give us your final, in probably 1 minute, your final remarks, and then we'll come back to you later.
Thank you very much. So the key takeaways from my remarks are that, one, the extractive business is an intrusive business, and by its very nature and necessity, it has to devise a process of managing risks and building resilience. The business goals and stakeholder interests can be integrated, and they are integral to the long-term success of mining activities. Such a strategy that integrates both can be a means of providing equitable returns on shareholder investment, at the same time taking care of stakeholder interests. Finally, the success and sustainability, that is the business performance of the extractive business in a fragile context such as Africa, requires an inclusive and integrated approach that brings the interests of all the stakeholders and business owners together in one holistic business strategy. In other words, mainstreaming social performance. Thank you.
Excellent as usual, Deji. Thank you so much for your intervention here. And you know, talking about mainstreaming social performance, I know is something that is near and dear to our next guest, Adam Matthews, who represents the Church of England and their investment fund. Adam, what's your view about how people who are really focusing on investing in the extractive sector can basically become more focused on mainstreaming social performance and not just making concepts like ESG some kind of tick box exercise? Adam?
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you, Chris, for inviting me, and great to be on such an excellent panel. And I very much defer to their knowledge. I represent a pension fund that's invested in the mining sector, and a pension fund that views the mining sector as hugely important to society, to the low carbon transition, and to many of the things that we use in everyday life. So to sort of think that we can't operate without the mining sector is a nonsense, and this sector is enormously important to many of the societal goals we have. So investors need to really sort of work with the sector constructively. There's many things that challenge investors to be invested in mining, because when things go wrong in the sector, they go wrong in very significant ways. We're all very familiar with the disasters, the significant sort of civil disputes that there can occur in the sector, and the environmental impacts. And so as I say, when it does go wrong, it really challenges us as a long-term institutional investor in terms of issues about ESG. And your point around tick box, I mean, if ESG is simply tick boxing, then we're going to fail, and this sector is going to struggle to retain its long-term institutional investors. ESG is much more about the whole values of the organization and how it addresses these issues in a really systemic way to demonstrate that it's possible to do mining well. It quite clearly is possible to do mining well. I've seen that example in some of the mine sites I've visited. I've seen very good management. I've seen fantastic engagement with workers. I've seen excellent engagement with communities. But I've also seen the other side of that, where it does go horribly wrong, and where we're engaged with communities in Brumadinho, in Brazil, where you've had the mine tailings disaster, where we've also been in contact with other communities where strikes around workers' rights have resulted in violence and have resulted in workers being killed, etc. So there's some real complexity and challenges in this sector. But my sense is the future for mining is a hugely positive one if we can get the sort of the social compact right here between all the stakeholders that that the previous speaker was outlining. And I think the opportunity is to really rethink and sort of position the dynamic between all the unions, the communities in which mines operate, government, investors, and companies themselves. And I just think that there's this moment now where we really need mining to think very ambitiously around the resource needs for the future, around the issues that challenge its ability to provide those resources. And when you look at the low carbon transition, which we've been doing as a group of investors over the past few weeks, you see enormous demand coming down the path. Incredibly concerned as to whether we're going to be able to meet that. It's going to require expansion of existing mines. It's going to require new mines. And yet there are a number of issues that fundamentally challenge the mining sector's ability to meet that demand. And therefore we need to be at the table with the mining companies, with all these other stakeholders, to ensure that we've actually got a common path and a common sort of sense of the changes that need to happen to be able to meet that demand and ensure that things like the low carbon transition are not fundamentally undermined because mining can't deliver the minerals needed for it. And so my sense is that if we can start to put those pieces in place, where I say there is that good practice already in the sector, but it needs to become normalized. Best practice should be the normal practice of mining, and investors need to work with companies to help them achieve that by driving global standards across all jurisdictions. It's not acceptable to have brilliant practice in your mines in this jurisdiction because they've got very good laws, and yet in another country where the laws may not be as advanced on mining, it operates to different standards. We need global standards of best practice that are driven, supported by investors, supported by other stakeholders into all the operations of mines. And I really think it's incumbent on investors to be working practically with the companies, with governments, and with all other stakeholders to ensure that we get to that point. I think you've got an example in the issue of tailings dams, where following Brumadinho, investors have sat at the table with companies, with the UN, and with a range of other stakeholders to devise a global standard where one didn't exist. We're now ensuring that companies adhere to that standard and support it. We're voting against the chairs and the boards of companies that don't support that global standard and aren't committing to implementing it. And in addition to that, we're working to create a global institution with the UN to ensure that at every mine site that standard is being applied and independently audited and evidenced is being applied. And so my sense is that in that, you have a model of how we can address the other systemic challenges in mining. It's not going to be easy and it's not going to be a comfortable ride for many companies. I know that. But the prize is that if we can work together on this, you can get to a sector that we all have confidence in, that will flourish, will meet the needs of society in the low carbon transition, and at the same time will be one that will be profitable for the owners and profitable for the countries, and that the societies in which they operate have comfort in what those mines are doing and how well they're doing it. Because if we don't manage it, you have a path that can be very different, and I fear that path, and really think that we've got to come together in this next 12-18 months to ensure that we've got a pathway to 2030 that really positions mining in Africa in where it needs to be. And if we get it right, then I think the future is very exciting, but there's a lot of work to be done.
Excellent, Adam. Thank you for your observations there. And I'll come back to you during the Q&A on some of the things that you raised. But I think a great segue here for my good friend Tracy Cooper, who is Executive Director of Mining Dialogues 360, is really to begin by asking you on whether you are seeing a real demonstration of the crucial importance of the social impact that Adam talks about, and whether communities on the ground, Tracy, are seen as beneficiaries, as the number one shareholder, so to speak, in this shared value and social compact continuum. Over to you, Tracy. You're on mute. Sorry, Tracy.
I think the administrators unmuted me, but I was just saying thank you for inviting me again to join this follow-up discussion from our previous webinar. Mining Dialogues being a not-for-profit organization, we operate mainly in South Africa, and our focus is on the social economic challenges that arise around mine settings. The thing around stakeholder engagement is there are a lot of processes and definitions. And I think we get very caught up in the technicalities of following process. And for me, good stakeholder engagement is about listening. It's about removing your preconceived ideas and your prejudices and really listening, maybe further, hearing what people are saying to you. And it's on that basis over the last 10 years that I've had the privilege of working with internationally regarded experts like Dr. Gavin Anderson, deeply in communities, where I'm perhaps just going to share some of the observations of what's happened and where we are now. Stakeholder engagement in the mining sector, as we're seeing it, is still very much, I would say, I have sympathy for the stakeholder engagement teams within companies who have to deal with these issues, because very often the focus is on those who are shouting the loudest, or those who are putting themselves forward as representatives of a given constituency, such as local business forums or factions of citizens in a locality. And in nearly all cases, this results in engagements that are skewed or biased in favor of a small group with a specific agenda. And so it's not really a true reflection or an expression of the wider concerns or aspirations of people in a locality around a mine site. So I can't overstate the importance of dialogue. Dialogue is a critical foundation that underpins the regulatory processes that we have to work within in South Africa, such as the integrated development plans and their aligned social and labor plans, which the mining sector needs to bring to the municipal development or regional development of an area. And these are regulatory cycles that run in 5-year periods and are aligned with each other. And the problem is that the ongoing weakness of these consultative processes or dialogues with community stakeholders translate into weak implementation. And so we're continuing to perpetuate these cycles of discontent, distrust, and increasing protest that is taking place, as colleagues in mining houses are telling me, across the country. It's no longer in specific commodity areas, it's actually happening everywhere. And you can't talk about this without highlighting the imbalance of power. There are those with the resources and the knowledge to take and implement decisions, and those who are under-resourced but expected to engage as equals in order to tick the box of having been consulted. And until mining communities are brought into a space where they have equal expression, equal voice, and are part of co-designing the future of what the ESG teams and the sustainability teams would like to develop in their area, we're never really going to move forward. And I really think there's a language change that needs to happen. We're still talking about beneficiaries. That means there's a benefactor, and the benefactor has the power. So we also need to reframe the kind of language that we use in order to reframe the thinking when we're consulting or engaging with people, specifically in the community settings. And you can see that communities and development practitioners are increasingly frustrated with the disconnect between plans and projects that are conceptualized, designed, and often measured in offices hundreds of miles away from the people and the places they were intended to work for. So ways around this are things such as increasing access to information through accelerating connectivity. And new technology is going to be a game changer, not only for knowledge sharing, but importantly for transparency in ESG. Removing the reliance for the investment community on self-reporting by businesses. There's sort of this tacit agreement that the companies will behave well and report in all honesty, whereas I think it's been certainly observed over periods of time that that's not necessarily the case. Every company is going to put its best foot forward. So unless there is a mechanism where there can be a level of ground truthing that balances that kind of reporting, the investment community is still making decisions based on one channel of information. So that needs to be addressed. Coming back to stakeholder engagement, Mining Dialogues has over the years really run two kinds. We have policy dialogues, which are basically held at a national or regional level, and those are around matters pertaining to policy, legislation, strategies, measures, instruments through which the state or mining companies can give effect to policy. And then more importantly, we run community dialogues, which take place at various levels locally, regionally, and it depends on the issue at hand, whether the community in question is a community of place, a community of interest, or a community of practice. So for us, successful stakeholder engagement in the community sense requires an in-depth understanding not only of context, but also the existing systems in a location. And these often take a lower rung on the priority ladder for corporate or donor agendas or bureaucracy and the optics through which they see things. For us, this is a crucial and non-negotiable place to start for anything you're going to have any shot at longevity or impact.
Right.
How can you work in any capacity from private sector to development in a place that you haven't sought to learn or to understand? So the crux is let local knowledge be your guide. It's imperative to involve local people in the design, the decision-making, and the implementation of any work you're hoping to engage in. Look at what is working on the ground. Ask how things are getting done, and then work with the systems already in place. Whether or not you understand or agree with those systems, they do exist. And they were also developed within the barriers of access to, and resource constraints that are a daily reality for most people in the rural areas where mining takes place. So if we work within those current frameworks and see what we can build and improve from there, then we're already changing the dynamic. And it's taking the mindset of don't reinvent wheels just because you don't recognize their shapes.
Excellent, Tracy. It's a good place for me to really invite Dr. David Matsinye from Amnesty International to join the conversation. David, Tracy was saying one of the key things about ethical mining aligned to ESG in Africa is that it must have at its heart a localized process of stakeholder engagement. The process must be authentic, must be based on hearing and listening, and that stakeholder number one are the local citizens. Is this what's happening in Mozambique? And what comes to mind is northern Mozambique in places like Cabo Delgado, where there are some extractive majors engaged there. What's the case study telling us about ESG? Does it work? Do they do it in such fragile jurisdictions? As Tracy and Adam say, it needs to be done. And of course, as Deji set us up.
I think the previous three speakers actually hit the nail in the right way, because what I'm going to say is exactly tailored, to what they have just said. When it comes to Mozambique, there are certain structural conditions that shape the politics of mining in that country. The biggest of which is the fact that Mozambique has 32 million people. That's the population. And 60%, actually over 60% of this population lives in rural areas. What that means is that the natural ecosystems in these rural areas are everything that these communities have. That's where their food comes from. That's where their water comes from. That's where their clean air, a healthy environment comes from. That's where the right to housing is fulfilled. And that's where the right to medicinal plants is fulfilled. So it is everything that they have based on the natural ecosystems. Over 60% of Mozambique's population concentrated in northern and central Mozambique, where we've had conflicts, and one of them is ongoing in Cabo Delgado. Unfortunately, that is where also these natural resources are discovered and mined in central and northern Mozambique. So if you take a look at the map of mining projects in Mozambique, you'll see that central and northern Mozambique are covered by projects of prospection and mining operations. And as I said, this is where the majority of the population is, and this is where we have conflict. In addition to that, this is where you see shocking levels of poverty, where the state has not done much to invest in services such as education, health, public infrastructure, water and sanitation and things like that, which makes these communities' dependency on their natural ecosystems even greater. All right. Now, unfortunately, these stakeholders, these populations are often seen as nuisance, standing on the way of progress, standing on the way of economic development, and so on. And when these community consultations happen, when they do, they are not meaningful, they're not genuine, they are often manipulated in favor of certain political elites in partnership with the mining companies. It excludes people from making decisions about their own communities, about what should happen with their lives. So as a result, we have a creation of these surplus populations in rural areas, surplus populations that have been dispossessed and dislocated from their land without alternative means of survival. These are surplus because they are not needed by the mining industry, by the extractive economies. They are disposable. They cannot be absorbed in the extractive economy because most of them do not have the required skills to be absorbed. Now, this is a big problem. So as a result of this, we have seen some youths, saying to themselves, there's nothing else to live for. Some of them have chosen a destructive path. And we see the conflict taking place in Mozambique, mostly made of these young people who have been dispossessed and dislocated from their communities without being given alternatives, without being absorbed. So this is a problem. I think what needs to change, just to emphasize yet again what has been said by the previous speakers, is to cease and desist to look at people in these rural areas as nuisance that must be removed, as barriers to economic development, to extractive economies, and instead look at them as people who risk everything in their lives. They risk their food, they risk their health environment, they risk their water, they risk their health, they risk everything. And all of that should be taken into consideration. It's not just the traditional investor who has his capital at the bank that should be viewed as the investor, who should be viewed as the risk taker. These communities as well should be viewed as risk takers, perhaps even more because they don't have insurance, and be treated as such in the design and implementation of mining projects. Thank you.
Wonderful insights there, Dr. Matsinye. And as I bring in Dr. Mandaza into the conversation, one of the things that strikes me from what we're discussing here today is that we have these euphemisms that we use, very technical speak. We talk of fragile jurisdictions. Shouldn't we call it what it is? Badly governed countries, where a lot of mining occurs, and this activity often leads to the creation of the disposable citizen and the creation of what I term as the distant state, Dr. Mandaza, this distant state that sees citizens as access to capacity, as barriers to economic development. It sounds very familiar when we think of the situation in Zimbabwe as it pertains sometimes to the extractive sector, Dr. Mandaza.
Thanks, Chris. I must say, I've also a connectivity problem today. For example, the audio is very itinerant, and I hope I understood your question. But I want to begin where my Mozambican counterpart ended, and which was a response to your initial question about the involvement of local stakeholders, the involvement of citizenry in the mining sector, and indeed, to what extent Zimbabwe is mainstreaming social performance issues over and above the property motive that has governed or underpins the extractive industry in Zimbabwe as it does in Southern Africa and in Africa as a whole.
Yep.
The first is to say the following, that basically mining in Zimbabwe has always been an imposition, a foreign imposition at the point of a gun from the very outset. And up to now, it is still the corporates who were established at the turn of the 20th century who still dominate mining in Zimbabwe. Having said that, there was a time when the corporates, such as Anglo American, Rio Tinto, and other major organizations, had a level of social responsibility in the form of major establishments. For example, housing schemes for employees, social facilities such as you had even football teams, secondary schools, training colleges, and so on and so forth. This seemed to have gone into the background. The major, for example, with Mangura mine, the copper mine in the western part of the country, which for generations had a very successful football team, which produced among many of our prominent soccer players, national players, but also which contributed immensely in terms of schooling, training, and so on and so forth. Even when at Independence, when I was in charge of human resource training and scholarships, we worked a lot with these multinationals, Rio Tinto, Anglo American, Mangura Mines, and even established colleges around the country, training institutions. These, for some reasons, these seem to have gone into abeyance, into oblivion. So basically what has developed over the time is a serious alienation of the citizenry from mining to a point of view where mining was really a foreign enterprise and with little or no impact on the local people. In recent years, there's risen the artisanal mining, where in the name of quote-unquote democracy, people have been allowed into mining with enormous ecological consequences. Areas of Shurugwi, if you know where that is, Mazowe, where I'm based, it's almost like a landmines all over the countryside. People are digging everywhere, under the railway lines, on the roads. It's an ecological disaster of no. And it appears that the authorities are unable or lack the moral authority to intervene in this, if also because many of them are the gold barons, as we call them in Zimbabwe, controlling territorially in terms of the mining industry large sections of the country, and these run into right to the top of the political hierarchy, so that in many respects the cartels that now control mining in Zimbabwe are really controlled by the political elite in our country. And that, of course, I see so far no impact at all in terms of the Glasgow protocols, no impact at all in terms of the kind of stuff we're talking about is so eloquently mainstreaming social performance, ESG. It is really a jungle, a mining disaster, if one might call it, with the associated illicit exports of minerals. Last time we had a webinar with GGA on mining. I made reference to 60% of our gold going through South Africa illicitly, 60%. And you can see that our revenue from gold in 2020 was $3.5 billion. That's after the 60%. So you can imagine we are losing so much in mining. And I was talking to some experts yesterday in preparation for this discussion, and I was told that our revenue from mining alone in Zimbabwe, taking into account the main minerals, platinum, diamonds, gold, nickel, copper, cobalt, and now lithium, should be something in the region of 50 billion per annum, 50 billion US dollars. Right now, it's a mere 6 billion. So you can imagine the hemorrhaging of potential of wealth in our country. It's enormous. I think I'll stop there, Chris.
Thank you, Dr. Mandaza. Some very concerning stats that you're sharing with us, and certainly from both of the case studies that we've heard of, one in Mozambique, one in Zimbabwe, Busisiyobi, we are beginning to understand that there is a real need for us to better manage some of these environmental, social, and governance risks, as was indicated in the title of our talk today. How do we begin to mainstream this ESG performance? Busi, any wise ideas from a governance perspective? Over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon to everyone. I think as a way of introduction, at the heart of being able to build sustainable economies that are resilient and dynamic in nature, the private sector is required to be willing and able to assume as well as address risks, right? And this means all types of risks, be it regulatory, environmental, and reputational risks, among many others. This is no different in the mining sector, particularly with the understanding that environmental, social, and governance factors have been historically overlooked by many firms. More than anything, I think ESG performance is to enable corporates to act as development partners. And this means being more proactive and strategic in how they engage governments as well as communities they operate in. So, as we've seen in recent years, a focus on how ESG factors are considered and addressed has taken global stage as a result of people increasingly showing more interest and concern about the world that they live in. In this way, and in many industries, particularly the extractives industry, as well as due to the nature of mining activities, which have led to greater scrutiny and therefore resulted in the deep, unique ESG risks the industry faces. On a more practical level, when looking at some of the environmental concerns, which include the general environmental degradation in the form of tailings, acid mine drainage, as well as the mine closure and rehabilitation process. So to put this in context, there's a recent story that came up that involves a toxic spill of acid mine water from an old disused coal mine shaft in Mpumalanga here in South Africa. And it has been reportedly killed tons of fish that has had a negative impact on the Wilgeri river system and the aquatic life of that particular region. This case actually also speaks to the poor mine closure and rehabilitation process. So when looking at some of the social risks, we cannot overlook the severity of some of the human rights violations and challenges, and of course, including child labor within the mining industry. Some of us may be familiar with the story in the DRC involving people of all ages, including children, obligated to work under very hard and harsh conditions. Some disturbing stats that I want to share is that of the 255,000 Congolese mining cobalt in the DRC, 40,000 are children, and some are even younger than 6 years old. So while it is important to recognize and acknowledge that there have been considerable efforts made to address issues related to environmental, social, and governance factors, there's still room for better management and mitigation of some of these issues in the sector. I want to quickly touch on some of the best practices that may ensure better management as well as mitigating ESG risks, and more importantly, how ESG performance can be mainstreamed in the sector. Firstly, being the issues identification process. So this entails full issues assessment that is informed by the community's needs as well as their developmental goals. Tracy touched on this around the integrated development plans as well as the social labor plans that need to be well developed and also well implemented in identifying some of these issues. Another thing that I want to highlight is the assessment and prioritization of these particular issues in these mining communities. So this is led by the context. It's not a one size fits all. And I believe that environmental concerns have increasingly taken center stage and have been prioritized, especially because they also overlap with some of the social elements and concerns. And then lastly, the stakeholder engagement, which has already been touched on, and also appropriate resource allocation. I think it is integral that there's an appropriate identification of all relevant and interested stakeholders that will be affected by ESG performance by mining companies. So this includes members of the state, members of the community in question, and of course, civil society. And then in closing, Chris, I just want to say that I think it's important to recognize that in order for ESG performance to be effective, there needs to be willingness and within the leadership teams at board level to be proactively establish and develop ESG frameworks that will align with the values and principles of their shareholders, investors, and most importantly, the communities that they operate in. Thank you. I'm going to hold it there for now.
Brilliant. That was Busisipo Siyobe, my colleague here at Good Governance Africa. She's also the head of our natural resource governance program. I'm really proud of your observations today, Busi. Very in-depth, certainly giving us an insight into some of those mitigation processes that we can undertake to really mainstream ESG. But it's all too well for us to look at it from a risk matrix, and I'm addressing this to you, Adam, as part of our Q&A now, that yes, certainly I get the point that we've got to focus on the process, maybe even in standardizing ESG, maybe an ISO provision around ESG. But as I say that, Adam, I'm concerned that in standardizing ESG, especially the S part, the social compact, the creating shared value, what we might have happening is a situation that sees us losing the direct intervention and the creativity that we are asking development partners like investors, like yourself, the pension fund that you represent, and certainly some of the miners. What's your view about that, Adam? Am I just pie in the sky?
No, I mean, I think the challenges that face mining, when you look at the sort of the systemic challenges, they require everybody to engage with them, and there's got to be a lot of that has got to be based on community engagement and bottom-up solutions where the knowledge, as previous speakers have said, is based. But there's also got to be some real honesty in the conversations and in identifying the solutions, and I think any one of the parties being responsible in totality is just not going to deliver a real solution. So I mean, I look at some of the work that's been done in South Africa in courageous conversations under Archbishop Thabo Mahova, in dialogue with the unions, in dialogue with companies, with all the different faith groups, and representatives from communities. There's been some very difficult conversations, and I think that is still a process in train, but it has enabled dialogue, conversations, I think an evolving shared vision of what a reformed mining sector needs to look like. And really, I think it's going to be that sort of co-creation of that path. And I think investors are a really important part of that and should be encouraging, supporting those kind of dialogues to occur. I hear from colleagues in Mozambique and in Zimbabwe of the challenges that they're describing, which sort of call for a similar kind of process that can have lots of stakeholders working together constructively to enable a real sort of feeling within communities that these companies are in these areas not just to extract something and disappear and leave the legacy in terms of waste and mine closure, but actually are there as part of the community, with the community, and the community have a stake in it. I think that does call for rethinking the model around mining, and I do think there is some leadership, I deliberately say some, that are willing to entertain different models of how we can sort of look at mining and the relationship it has with communities and the stakes they have in those local sites. I also look at challenges like automation. You could see a massive rollout of automation, and we talk about the just transition in climate change. What's the just transition in automation where you could see significant workers displaced by automation? Now, at one level, automation is good. It has efficiencies, it has safety consequences that are good. At another level, it could displace many people and fundamentally change the relationship between the community that was previously providing workers to a mine that now aren't providing workers, and there's that no financial benefit there. And again, I think that changes the dynamic. So I think we've got to look at some of these challenges really in honest conversations, and I think courageous conversations that's been tried in South Africa offers a potential model here where you have all parties around the table dealing honestly with some of these things, but to get to a common vision of a future for mining that's different.
Adam, I'm going to stop you there because I don't want us to miss this point that you're raising here. And I'm addressing this as sort of bringing him into the conversation at this stage, Dr. David Matsinyo, because in Mozambique, you talk about disposable citizens, a state that is very distant. In actual fact, some of the concepts that I use are counterterrorism to describe these communities, preventing violent extremism, countering violent extremisms, PVE, CVE, countering terrorism. And that basically means that the men in green step in, and we see it becoming a militarized, securitized discussion very quickly. Is that your view, David?
Absolutely, because these kind of intervention, the militaristic intervention, which is almost exclusive, forgets the processes through which what they're trying to solve has come about. The process of governance itself that has been responsible for producing the conditions of possibility for all these insurgents, for all this discontent to come about. The problem of poverty, inequality, abuse of power, not wanting to share it. All those things have created this problem. But when it comes to addressing the problem, they only see the militaristic solution. There's no talk about investing in education, investing in social services, a comprehensive package of interventions that include not only militarism, but also these other social and economic and environmental aspects of the problem. Therefore, in my view, the militaristic intervention exclusively is futile. It is only going to escalate the problem because the root conditions will remain, and in fact, they will aggravate. That's a fundamental problem that needs to be addressed, and which I think up to so far is being ignored.
So Tracy Cooper, in a situation where you've got this sort of distant state that David Matsinya talks about, predatory state, that really looks at extracting or rent-seeking in many instances. How do you develop these authentic conversations, these crucial conversations that Adam talks about in situations where the state might perceive these citizens as an obstacle to rent-seeking? Tracy?
In sub-Saharan Africa, we do have growing distrust in the state as government, as being able to provide law and order, good governance, service delivery to the citizens. And so it's become incumbent upon the private sector to step up and step into that role, to the extent that we see mining companies in various jurisdictions actually seconding staff to local municipalities in order to help them with the basic capacities that they need to deliver such services as water, waste collection, and so forth. And those are in the towns that have those facilities. Yep. I'm not even talking about the informal settlements and the conditions that people live in there. Really, I think it's incredibly important that the investment community has finally stepped up and gotten off the fence. There is an ethical economic obligation to begin creating the right conditions for change to happen. And I think that only through the partnership between the current sort of investment community, such as the fund managers and organizations, pension funds, such as what Adam manages, working in concert with impact investors who see the potential in these areas and have slow, patient capital. So essentially, you're kind of taking a carrot and a stick approach. You know, you're wielding the power of withholding capital or investing capital in organizations or in areas for development that meet a criteria, an ESG criteria, whatever your standard might be, and there are quite a lot.
Yep.
But if the mining sector can then, at the same time, and the investment sector, bring in impact investors as partners into that same space, so that you're looking at creating those transitions for alternative economic development to be leveraged off mining while there is still life of mine, so that you're not leaving behind negative legacies, then that is something that really needs to be brought into these conversations. Mm-hmm. And just to maybe to share with you a quote from somebody, a sentiment from somebody not only 2 weeks ago on the ground, that really brings it home for me and what we're trying to work with on a daily basis. This lady said outside of a presidential climate commission change meeting in the Northern Cape, "What is this ESG or just transition? It means nothing to us. It's just more clever words so you can go on making money while nothing changes for us living here." And that goes to the heart of it.
Indeed. Tracy, thank you so much for that. I'd like to encourage our audience who are watching out there to comment using the chat service there. And your comments will come to us and we'll try and bring them into the conversation. But in doing so, Deji Hastrup, there's a question really directed to you from our friend, Ross Harvey. And he says, a big question for him is how we manage to convince shareholders that long-term returns should trump short-term extractives, which kills long-run value. Typical question from an economist, wouldn't you say, Deji? But
Right.
Ross, you won't be surprised.
Well, one of the things that I have noticed is, mining, the extractive industry has a history. And the unfortunate thing is that history is adversarial. So it's important to understand this. Stakeholders, first of all, must see a mutuality of interest. It is not true that you cannot pursue one without the other. And one of the things that we have to try to do in the conversations we have is to show all stakeholders. I personally consider shareholders as stakeholders, especially the institutional shareholders. They have a great stake in the business. They have a great opportunity to impact lives in society. And so if people focus on positive mutuality and try to, as somebody said, listen with humility and honesty to other stakeholders who may or may not have their primary interest as their focus, then there is a potential to align interests, to be inclusive in the strategies that we come up with. And this is possible. There are ways to do this. It has been done in other jurisdictions. And without reinventing the wheel, we can borrow some of the best practices in some of these jurisdictions. But the first thing is to unlearn a history, because there is a history behind the extractive industry and other stakeholders. That has to be reversed. We have to look at the opportunities that we have now to redress the past by being inclusive and incorporating. The question of all these very academic terms, ESG, where local communities find it difficult to understand. And when local communities ask the questions they are asking from a perspective of a history. In turning around that history, we have to understand and be humble, patient, and honest in listening to stakeholders. But it's quite possible. It's also important to develop what I call a community-driven perspective on development. So it's not a benefactor versus beneficiary, but it is the mutuality of interest of joint stakeholders. Both investors and stakeholders have an interest in the success of mining. And if it's presented that way, and if those who manage the process understand the importance of the mutuality of interest and streamlining and mainstreaming social performance into the business strategy, then progress will be made. But the first thing is to understand that there is a history.
Thank you for those sage words, Deji. A couple of comments reading from the chat that's going on is directed to Busi, my colleague. He says, Busi has expounded great insights on the actual value of ESG. Big tick there to Busi. And then another comment coming from Maloba Tehla. He says, incredibly insightful session. And he says in continuation of that, it's funny, not so funny, is that the same question around social performance is being asked of, quite correctly, the renewable energy sector. It is simply not enough for clean kilowatts. What's needed is meaningful economic activities in localities. And Tracy says, indeed, a new business model is needed. But actually, before I read Tracy's comment, let me bring in Dr. Ibo Mandaza. Dr. Mandaza, I hope you've been following the conversation well. Are you still with us, Dr. Mandaza?
Yes, I am.
Excellent.
Yes, I
am. Dr. Matsinya says, if I understand what Tracy is putting forward to us, and I think what many of the other speakers have been saying, is that in actual fact, what mining companies need is a new business model. They need to innovate their business models to incorporate services to communities and human rights. So it's a total overhaul. It's not just mainstreaming ESG, as we're saying today in the title, but changing the business model. Do you agree?
I agree. I agree entirely, but I don't think it should be left to the mining houses alone. I think it needs to be a policy framework.
Yeah.
Even a regional policy, or even continental policy, which places responsibilities on the state itself, the mining houses, and the stakeholders, and becomes a pattern across the continent. I don't think that it should be left to the mining house alone, or to the mining houses and the state alone. I think there's need to, maybe through such fora as the GGA, the Southern African Research Mining Watch, and other organizations, to try and develop a policy framework which institutes this kind of policy that you are talking about.
Indeed. Indeed.
Can I respond to that, Chris? Because I mean, I think it's absolutely right, because I just think you can't leave it to the mining companies, you can't leave it to the investors, you can't leave it to any one constituency. And I think we're all saying quite clearly that there are multiple interests, multiple stakeholders that need to have a shared sense of where mining needs to get to, the challenges, the shared ownership of those, and then working through what an equitable path is there. And I think that does call for rethinking the model of mining in a number of places. I think there's opportunity to do that. I do think you have some new leadership of some significant companies. I think if we rely simply on ESG and ESG indicators to get there, it will not happen. This is much more fundamental than that. If you look at the Juukan Gorge disaster in Australia, where you had traditional owners in a relationship with a company, disproportionate power imbalance, and then a 46,000-year-old heritage site blown up by a company, by any ESG indicator, was probably the best or one of the best at managing community relationships. It shows the weakness of ESG. So I think as investors, we need to require much more internal rigor within the management that engages with these challenging issues. We need challenge within company boards that challenges the management. We also need independent verification that global standards are being applied at individual mine sites. And I think that calls for a different structure that I think we're modeling in tailings, where you have a global standard and you'll have individual site level verification, independently verified it's been applied, transparency supporting that to give confidence it's working. And then I think you've got to have a process of dialogues within country at regional levels, etc., that is multi-stakeholder. I think churches in some jurisdictions have a very important role in convening that. I do think it has to involve the unions, it has to involve community groups, and it has to involve leadership that's willing to listen and engage and recognize that that is their path to ensuring that their business is able to flourish. And otherwise, I think the alternate path is the one that I think we've had other speakers describe of the challenges, and we'll see the sort of the opposition grow and grow. So my sense is if we can think of some of these interventions in very practical, constructive ways, then I think we can sort of move this agenda forward. But it does require all the parties to be at the table, including government, but not one of them is actually going to provide the ultimate solution. It's a collective endeavor here. And I think in lots of instances, that's going to require a lot of trust to be built, to be done. But the problem we've got is we don't have a huge amount of time as well. And so that there's a challenge there of building that trust in the time we have.
So Busisi Yobe, you obviously following the conversation. Adam, almost as the sidebar conversation that we had earlier on, basically saying it's not one or the other. It's a false dichotomy. It's all of us as partners for development. Has that been the view? But before you answer, Tracy Cooper is in very revolutionary mode. She says we have to move away from the neoliberal profit at all costs model of the past and development and develop ethical economic models that prioritize people and the planet. Revolutionary and definitely needs to be mainstream. Busi, what's your view?
Thank you, Chris. I think I want to echo what Adam has already touched on, that it is going to require a multi-stakeholder engagement, government, mining companies, and of course, civil society and the communities in question. I think also what's going to be important is to capacitate the state, and we did have this discussion earlier on, in making sure that there are governance mechanisms to enable transparency and accountability within the sector. So I think capacitating government is going to be an important one, and also not just to rely on ESG frameworks, but to also ensure that the mining companies at board level are willing and are proactive in the strategies that they put forward in ensuring development takes root.
Excellent. So as we're having this discussion, maybe I can go to Dr. Matsinye and basically ask, especially looking at the case study of Mozambique that you presented, how then do you think governments and other regulatory authorities can basically ensure that this ESG approach is really something that they are held accountable to implement and not just take as a nice to have?
Yes, I mean, it's as Tracy was saying at the beginning, that we cannot expect mining companies to just, respect, the principles of human rights and the environment, and provide services. It has to be legislation. It has to be a state, a government that create laws and enforce them. I think that principle applies to the government itself. We cannot expect our African governments, because we know them. We cannot expect them to voluntarily begin to put in place legislation and enforce it for the benefit of their own people. There must be a coalition of civil society, of communities, of international human rights organizations, and organizations such as GGA to come together and demand that kind of accountability, that kind of initiative, and care for the people, because that's what they are here for. So we cannot expect them to do it voluntarily. We have to demand it. We have to put pressure. I think, if there is any hope, it should come from that kind of coalition.
Can I make a comment?
Oh, go ahead, Deji. Tracy had a hand up. Tracy will come back to you after Deji.
Okay, no. Go ahead. Tracy first, please. Let Tracy go first. I'll come back.
Tracy, go ahead. Oops. Yeah, there you go. You've been unmuted. Go ahead, Tracy.
I was just saying thank you to Deji. He's always the gentleman. But back to the conversation, that Boosie started, that Adam commented on, and now further, this whole concept around ESG is huge. It's complex. It's not one size fits all. It's very jurisdiction dependent. There are so many moving parts in these kinds of conversations that I think that there's almost a level of paralysis around where do we start? How do we start? And I think perhaps a way through that is for a smaller grouping of the investment communities, a mining house in a particular jurisdiction, to initiate a process that can at least start something moving, showing people how we can actually get to that higher level policy intervention. We certainly know from the South African government perspective that there is a level of inaction around a number of critical issues, around the mine closure and rehabilitation policy. The ASM policy that's just come out is inadequate at best. So there are so many issues that fall under the ESG umbrella that it just becomes so overwhelming that we continue to have these talks. But if we could start somewhere and have some on the ground demonstrable actions, that people have something tangible to work with, we may actually be able to progress the conversation into that wider format and up those levels to national policy level or global policy level that we've been talking about. I think we need to start somewhere small and make mistakes and have some successes and learn.
Excellent suggestion, Tracy. JG, over to you, sir.
She took the words out of my mouth. I want exactly what I wanted to say is that sometimes this can be overwhelming because of the history again. I mean, we have a history that we're trying to change. Change is not the easiest thing. We're looking for a new model, a new approach, a new way of approaching business that is significantly different from what existed in the past. So that can be daunting for some businesses and even some community stakeholders. So it's important, first of all, to recognize that we're trying to shift a paradigm that has been entrenched for some time. The second thing is the how. There are people who are convinced of the need for change, but they just don't know how. This is not something they've done before. They're not used to. I mean, business is not used to listening to people in communities telling it how to run its business. This is a new way. And so they are, even when they're convinced there's a need for change, they're asking themselves, so how do we do this? And sometimes because of this, there's a paralysis, as Tracy said, because I haven't done this before. I don't know what they want me to do. Where do I start? So there's probably a need to devise prototypes or models that can be shared with people of things that can work, and then try to start it. You know, you can talk for a long time about anything, but until you put it to test, you can't be sure how it's going to work. So it's important to develop an action plan.
Yep.
How do we get the right stakeholders in the room to come up with a how? It's all now a how. From my perspective, I think that we've gotten to a point where it's obvious to most stakeholders that there's a need for change. But how to go about it is what is the next step.
Great, excellent place to stop, Deji. I'm really worried about the time, so I'm going to press our speakers a bit today, and I'm going to start off with Dr. Mandaza and ask you really in about 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes, give us your final observations and views as we begin to wind down this conversation. Dr. Mandaza.
No, thanks, Chris. I have little to say, except two things. One is to say how I feel more educated after this session with the experts who have spoken very eloquently about this important sector, and also to realize the important work being done through GGA with respect to this subject. Secondly, is to hope and commit ourselves to the need for a new continental policy on mining, which seeks to address both the pathologies and legacies of the past and puts ourselves as Africans on the right foot in terms of ensuring that the maximum benefit is bequeathed to our communities in particular, to our countries in general, and that we reverse, as a matter of course, this curse, the mining curse that has been a curse for over 100 years in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much Dr. Mandaza. Tracy Cooper, your final words, please, ma'am.
First of all, thank you for having me on this webinar, this follow-up conversation, and looking forward to the next one at GGA's event at Mining Indaba. It's always a pleasure to interact with these colleagues in these conversations. I guess, you know, there's the cynical view around ESG, which is it's simply a switch in syntax. You've changed the title of your sustainability report to say ESG, and that it's the latest iteration of an ongoing, you know, series of feel-good, investor-friendly products. Or there's what I like to take, which is the more optimistic view, that now is the time. The world is ready. ESG has come of age from the days of CSR and CSIR, and we can harness this energy to truly create systemic change. And that's what I'd really like to see happen, especially in such an important sector as the mineral sector, which has an inordinately outsized role to play in that development.
Excellent, as usual. Thank you so much for being with us today, Tracy. Adam, over to you, sir.
I'm going to subscribe to what Dr. Mandaza said. I agree with him, quite honestly. So he said what needs to happen. I just commit that the investors I'm working with, there's many trillions aligned to really trying to play our role properly, and that's requiring us to think quite differently about how we have operated, how we've interacted with company boards, our expectations of them when we need to change management if they're not responsive. And I just think that we're on a journey. We're conscious it's going to involve all other stakeholders in helping shape that path. We're trying to define a vision for 2030, and let's have it one that's shaped around the description Dr. Mandaza gave.
Excellent. Mr. Hastrup, over to you, sir.
Well, I'd like to thank you all very much. I'm impressed about the amount of knowledge around this subject and the willingness to share. I'd just like to say as a final word that we need to focus on developing an quote-unquote action plan around these issues. I think that there might be opportunities to engage with CEOs of mining companies. There might be opportunities to engage with human rights, environmental rights, and climate change organizations on these issues, and develop an inclusive, multi-stakeholder platform to launch into this new model of doing business in the 21st century, so that we can move the conversation beyond a conversation into action.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Dr. Matsinye, over to you. Final words.
Well, it's been an honor and a privilege to share this panel with my colleagues here. I learned a lot having this dialogue. I just wanted to add by taking into the emphasis that Adeji has been making on history. And I also suspected that if we look into that history, we will also find companies not having it as their business to influence governments on respect, protection, and promotion and fulfillment of human rights. But I believe that mining companies have a great lever of power to bring that influence to bear on governments. For governments to actually respect economic, social, cultural, environmental, civil, and political rights, because that in the long run is in the best interest also of mining companies, of governments, and of citizens at large. Thank you.
Thank you so much, my brother, Dr. David. We really appreciate you being here. Busi Siobe, last but certainly not least, please take us home.
No, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you to all of our speakers for sharing their insights. I think we can all agree that ESG management and performance, it's a very overwhelming and complex process. I think with the understanding of our mining communities and also the willingness from our leadership teams within mining companies, we will achieve sustainable development. And I'd like to close it there. Thank you, Chris.
Brilliant stuff. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. There's much to be addressed, and you can rest assured that at GGA, we are committed to strengthening and certainly mainstreaming ESG performance in fragile mining jurisdictions. In one way, by ensuring that better governance takes root. You know, that process about who gets what, when, and how, the authoritative allocation of resources, as we heard today, it needs to be focused at the citizen. So to this end, our recent Wicked Conversation series campaign paid close attention to the recent High Court judgment related to Shell South Africa using seismic tests to explore for oil off South Africa's coastline. Through this campaign, our in-house researchers and external writers assess the nature of the court's judgment, how it has read the law and examined the interplay between natural resource governance and environmental concerns. Our researcher, Vincent Obisi Orlu, who is in Busi's Natural Resource Governance Program, also produced an intelligence report focused on the implications of COP26 for the mining industry. So if you are interested in learning more about what's going on in the extractive sector and about ESG and natural resource governance, please go to our website. It's www.gga.org. And we certainly look forward to working with all of our interlocutors. And I'd like to thank our speakers today for their deep and really meaningful insights today. Until next time, everybody at home and wherever you may be, take care and happy Easter if you do celebrate.
Plato said, "Who will guard the guardians? Who are our guardians? Do they care about us? Are they accountable for their actions, or are they above the law? Who elects these guardians? Us? Them? Someone else? And if they guard us, who will guard them? Who will guard the guardians? The Malin Guardian, if you really want to know."